As the neon sign flickered above the dingy building, my heart pounded with a mix of betrayal and desperation. Stepping inside, I was greeted by dim lighting and the faint scent of lavender. When her voice drifted from a back room, hushed and urgent, I froze, unable to believe what I was hearing. I came to confront my wife about the rumors, but the truth was far darker than I could have imagined. By the time I got to her office a number of times in the past decade, my Uncle Frank was mostly dead by then. This wasn't just infidelity, it was a dangerous game with stakes that threatened to unravel everything. But before we dive deeper into this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a moment. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mingling with the sweet aroma of pancakes sizzling on the griddle. Sunlight poured through the wide kitchen windows, casting a golden glow on the table where two young girls giggled over their plates. Emily stood by the stove, flipping pancakes with practiced ease, her golden hair catching the morning light. Her laughter was warm, effortless, a melody that made the walls of their suburban home feel alive. "Mom, Sophie stole my syrup again," their youngest daughter Lily protested, pointing an accusing finger at her older sister. Sophie smirked, her face smeared with a telltale trail of sticky sweetness. "Did not," Sophie countered, her grin betraying her guilt. "Girls, enough," their father interjected, a half smile on his face as he reached for his coffee. "We're a family of sharers, remember?" Emily turned, spatula in hand, her eyes meeting his across the room. "The rock of the family, as always," she teased, her voice light but affectionate. He chuckled, taking a sip of coffee and watching the scene unfold as if it were a painting. Vivid, perfect, but somehow distant. As they sat down to breakfast, their laughter filled the room, but the husband couldn't shake an odd sensation. Something beneath the surface felt off. It was subtle, like a single sour note in an otherwise perfect symphony. But then Lily demanded another pancake, and the moment passed. He shook off the feeling, chalking it up to fatigue or stress. After all, wasn't this what he had always wanted? A loving wife, two beautiful daughters, and a home that felt like a sanctuary. It was the dream, a perfect illusion he didn't yet realize was about to shatter. The husband's voice softened, tinged with both warmth and melancholy, as he began narrating their journey. "We were college sweethearts, Emily and I," he began, his tone reflective. "She was the kind of woman who lit up every room she entered, effortlessly charming, fiercely intelligent, and with a laugh that could make even the grumpiest professor crack a smile. Me? I was steady, reliable, the guy who made sure the car had gas and the bills were paid on time. Together, we made sense, like two halves of a whole." He remembered their first tiny apartment, a cramped, drafty studio with peeling wallpaper and a kitchen the size of a closet. But it was theirs, and they'd filled it with dreams. Emily had painted one wall a bold shade of red, declaring it the passion corner. They'd spent countless nights talking about their future, their plans stretching endlessly ahead, untainted by reality. "Those were simpler times," he said, his voice dropping. "We didn't have much, but we had each other, and that felt like enough." Eventually, the years brought changes. Careers blossomed, a mortgage was signed, and two daughters arrived, filling their lives with chaos and joy in equal measure. He had assumed their love would adapt, evolving to fit this new chapter. And for a while, it seemed to. But somewhere along the way, life got louder, he admitted. There were school plays, work deadlines, soccer practices, and PTA meetings. And Emily, she was incredible, juggling it all with a grace I could never manage. But in the quiet moments, when it was just us, I began to notice the silences. They weren't uncomfortable, just empty. He shook his head as if trying to brush away the thought. Still, I told myself it was normal. After all, no one stays in the honeymoon phase forever, right? We had built a life, a good life. But looking back now, I wonder if I missed the signs. If I ignored the cracks because I was too afraid of what might be hiding beneath. The husband's voice paused, weighted by the memory. That morning, as we sat around the breakfast table, I believed we were untouchable, a team, a family. I didn't know then that sometimes the most beautiful illusions are the easiest to break. At first, it was almost imperceptible, like the faintest ripple disturbing the surface of a still pond. Emily began coming home a little later than usual. Her explanations were always plausible. A meeting ran long, she got caught in traffic, or she stopped by the store. The husband didn't think much of it. After all, she was a busy woman with a lot on her plate. But then there were the moments with her phone. It became a near-constant presence in her hand, the screen lighting up with messages she would quickly swipe away. Sometimes, she'd smile faintly at something she read, her lips curling into an expression that felt just a bit too private. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching a movie, he noticed her glance at her phone and then set it face down on the table. Her attention seemed divided, her laughter at the jokes on screen just a fraction delayed. "Who's texting you so much?" he asked casually, keeping his tone light. Emily didn't miss a beat. "Stacy," she replied with a small laugh. "You know how ridiculous she can be." Her answer seemed innocent enough, but something about her body language, how quickly she looked away, the slight tightening of her jaw, made him wonder if she wasn't telling the whole truth. Still, he dismissed the thought, chalking it up to his own overthinking. After all, she was Emily, the woman he trusted with his whole heart. As the weeks passed, the changes became harder to ignore. Emily seemed more distracted, her laughter lighter, but less frequent. She began lingering in the other room to take phone calls, her voice muffled and low. Once, he walked in unexpectedly, and she abruptly ended the call. "Just Stacy again," she said, with a breezy smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Small inconsistencies started piling up, tiny pebbles forming the foundation of doubt. One night, she came home smelling faintly of a perfume he didn't recognize. "New lotion," she explained with a shrug, brushing off his question as if it were insignificant. He wanted to believe her. He needed to. The turning point came during a rare quiet evening at home. Emily had excused herself to the kitchen, leaving her phone unattended on the counter. For a moment, he considered picking it up, just to glance at the screen. But as quickly as the thought came, he pushed it away, feeling a pang of guilt. Snooping wasn't who he was. Yet, later that night, as he lay awake beside her, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing, the nagging thoughts refused to leave him. What if there was something she wasn't telling him? What if the cracks he'd been pretending not to see were deeper than he wanted to admit? The questions began to take root, but still, he told himself he was overthinking. Emily was his wife, his partner. Surely there was nothing to worry about, or so he hoped. It happened late one night, long after the girls had gone to bed. The house was cloaked in silence, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint rustling of leaves outside. The husband lay in bed, unable to sleep, his mind restless with fragments of lingering unease. Emily had said she was catching up on emails downstairs, but as the minutes stretched into an hour, he began to wonder. Eventually, he heard it. A soft murmur, barely audible over the stillness. He sat up, straining to listen. Emily's voice carried up the stairs, low and cautious, the words indistinct but the tone unmistakably hushed. Unable to resist, he quietly slipped out of bed and crept to the top of the staircase. Peering into the dimly lit living room, he saw her sitting on the edge of the couch, her phone pressed to her ear, her posture tense. "No, not now," she whispered, her voice urgent. "He's here." The words hit him like a jolt of electricity. His breath caught, and his pulse quickened. He froze, torn between stepping into the room and retreating unseen. Questions swirled in his mind. Was this really happening? Was he reading too much into an innocuous conversation? The thought of confronting her felt overwhelming, yet the idea of staying silent gnawed at him even more. Before he could decide, Emily hung up and glanced toward the stairs, as though sensing his presence. He quickly retreated to the bedroom, his heart pounding in his chest. Lying back down, he stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. Doubt had transformed into a heavy, suffocating suspicion, and there was no way to ignore it now. The following days were marked by an unsettling quietness between them, a palpable tension that neither acknowledged. The husband began watching Emily more closely, his observations growing sharper with every passing moment. At breakfast, he noticed how her gaze flicked toward her phone whenever it buzzed, her expression carefully neutral as she silenced the notifications. She'd offer explanations when he asked, "Work's been busy," or "Stacy's dealing with drama again." But they felt rehearsed, lacking the effortless warmth he was used to. During dinner, her laughter at the girls' jokes felt forced, like an actor delivering a line they no longer believed in. He found himself scrutinizing every word, every gesture, searching for cracks in the facade. She still smiled, still kissed him goodnight, but there was a distance in her touch, a subtle withdrawal that left him aching. One evening, she returned home later than usual, claiming a client meeting had run long. As she set her purse down, he noticed her makeup looked fresher than it should have after a long day. He wanted to ask, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he studied her face, looking for any sign that she might offer the truth unprompted. The silence between them deepened, growing heavier with each passing interaction. Though Emily acted as though nothing had changed, the husband couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on opposite sides of an invisible divide. For every question he didn't ask, a dozen more grew in his mind. And with each unanswered suspicion, the weight of betrayal became harder to ignore. The perfect illusion was unraveling, thread by thread. Yet he couldn't decide whether to pull it apart completely or cling to what remained. The next Saturday, as the husband sat nursing his second cup of coffee, he realized he needed an outside perspective. The unease had grown unbearable, a constant gnawing in his mind. Tom, his oldest and most trusted friend, seemed like the right person to turn to. If anyone could offer clarity, it would be him. He certainly did not present the same. Later that afternoon, they met at a quiet bar on the edge of town. The dim lighting and low hum of conversation created an atmosphere of privacy. The husband took a long sip of his beer before finally breaking the silence. "Tom," he began, his voice heavy, "I think something's going on with Emily." Tom raised an eyebrow, his expression carefully neutral. "What do you mean?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. For a moment, the husband hesitated, unsure how much to share. Then, like a dam breaking, the words spilled out. He recounted the late nights, the phone call, the distant looks. As he spoke, Tom's face remained unreadable, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the side of his glass. When the husband finished, he leaned back, waiting for Tom's response. The silence stretched uncomfortably before Tom finally spoke. "Look, man," he said slowly, avoiding eye contact. "Are you sure you want to dig into this? Sometimes it's better to let things play out." The husband frowned. "What are you saying? That I should just ignore it?" Tom sighed, running a hand through his hair. "No, that's not what I mean. It's just, what if it's nothing? What if you're overthinking and you end up making things worse?" "But what if it's not nothing?" the husband shot back, his voice rising slightly. "What if I'm right?" Tom hesitated again, his discomfort evident. "If you're right," he said finally, "then you need to be prepared for what you'll find, because once you open that door, there's no going back." The words hung in the air like a warning. The husband stared at his friend, searching his face for answers he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. Tom's reluctance only deepened his doubts, leaving him with more questions than when he'd arrive. It was raining. By the time they parted ways, The husband felt no closer to the truth. If anything, Tom's hesitance had only confirmed one thing. He couldn't ignore the signs any longer. The truth, whatever it was, demanded to be uncovered. It happened on a quiet Tuesday evening. The girls were asleep, their soft breathing drifting down the hall, and Emily had left her phone on the kitchen counter while stepping outside for a phone call. The husband, who was cleaning up after dinner, noticed the device light up with a notification. At first, he hesitated. The idea of invading her privacy felt wrong, a line he wasn't sure he should cross. But as the screen glowed, displaying the name Mike, followed by a string of heart emojis, his curiosity overwhelmed his restraint. His heart pounded in his chest as he reached for the phone, hands trembling slightly. The texts were right there, bright and undeniable against the dark interface. Mike, can't stop thinking about you today. That dress last night? Wow. I guarantee you. Emily, you're terrible, but thank you. You always know how to make me smile. No sooner had Emily finished her flirtation with Posse, his vision blurred, and for a moment it felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him. He scrolled further, each message more damning than the last. Flirty exchanges, compliments, inside jokes. His breath hitched when he saw one that read, "Loneliness can be no more complicated than giving. Mike, when can I see you again? Emily, soon, I hope. I miss you too." The phone slipped slightly in his sweaty palm as he placed it back on the counter. He stood frozen, his mind racing with a million questions. Was this new? Had she been hiding this for weeks? Months? Years? The very foundation of their life together felt as though it were crumbling before his eyes. When Emily walked back inside, smiling casually as she thanked someone on the phone, he quickly stepped away, pretending to busy himself with wiping the counter. The sight of her so at ease made his stomach twist in knots. She was laughing, her voice light and untroubled, while he felt as though his world had just shattered. That night he lay awake, staring at the ceiling as the damning messages replayed in his mind. He felt a mix of anger, hurt, and confusion, each emotion crashing over him like relentless waves. He wanted to confront her immediately, to demand answers and hear her explanation. But a quieter, more cautious voice urged him to wait. What if there was more to uncover? What if confronting her now only pushed her to hide the truth further? He turned the thoughts over in his mind, weighing the options. Confronting her without more evidence might lead to lies or half-truths. If he waited, he could find out everything, when it started, how deep it went, and, most importantly, why. The decision felt heavy, but he resolved to wait and watch. He would gather more proof, piece together the full story, and confront her when he had no doubt left in his mind. Until then, he would act as if nothing had changed, a painful charade that twisted the knife in his heart with every passing moment. As he closed his eyes, he knew the coming days would be a test of patience and resolve. But the truth, however painful, was now unavoidable. The next evening, Emily announced she had an errand to run, her voice as casual as ever. She kissed the girls goodnight and grabbed her keys. The husband, feigning indifference, nodded and watched her leave. But as soon as the door clicked shut, he grabbed his jacket and followed, his heart pounding with a mix of guilt and determination. He kept a safe distance as she drove through the familiar suburban streets, her taillights glowing faintly in the darkness. But as they turned onto a less traveled road, the surroundings began to shift. Well-lit storefronts gave way to dingy shops with faded signs, their windows plastered with ads for quick loans and discount liquor. Finally, Emily pulled into a dimly lit parking lot outside a nondescript building with darkened windows. The neon sign above the entrance flickered weakly. Relaxations Spa. The sight of it sent a chill down his spine. From his parked car, he watched as Emily stepped out, her posture rigid, and entered the building without a backward glance. The husband's hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The place reeked of secrecy, the kind of establishment people entered quietly, hoping no one would notice. The longer he sat there, the more his mind raced with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. As the minutes ticked by, the husband remained in his car, a storm of emotions swirling within him. He replayed every suspicious moment over the past few weeks, each one now sharpened by the realization of where she was. The building itself seemed to exude a sense of unease. The faint glow of the neon sign reflected on the damp pavement, casting eerie shadows. Occasionally, someone would enter or exit, a hurried figure with their head down, glancing furtively at their surroundings. Every movement seemed charged with secrecy, feeding his growing sense of dread. Inside his mind, the questions grew louder. What is she doing in there? Is this really what it looks like? Could there be another explanation? Each possibility felt more damning than the last, and yet, a small part of him clung to the hope that he was wrong. He considered barging in, demanding answers, but the thought of confronting her in such a place made his stomach churn. Instead, he stayed rooted in place, torn between the urge to act and the fear of what he might uncover. The seconds stretched into an eternity, each one thick with suspense. The darkness outside seemed to press in closer, wrapping around him like a shroud. And still, he waited, the weight of uncertainty growing heavier with every breath. Inside, Tim stood for what seemed like the death longest of his life, longing for everything. As the minutes dragged on, his patience broke. He couldn't sit idle any longer. With a deep breath, he stepped out of the car and approached the building. The air was heavy with a faint, perfumed scent that only heightened his unease. Pushing the door open, he entered a dimly lit lobby. The walls were painted a faded beige, and soft, generic music played in the background. A young woman behind the reception desk looked up, startled. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice cautious. He didn't waste time. "I'm looking for Emily," he said, his voice firm but edged with tension. "Where is she?" The receptionist blinked, clearly taken aback. "I'm sorry, but I don't know anyone by that name." He leaned closer, his frustrations spilling over. "Don't play games with me. I know she's here. Just tell me the truth." Before the woman could respond, another employee stepped into the room, frowning. "Sir, you need to calm down," she said, her tone stern. "Don't tell me to calm down," he snapped. "I know what's going on here." The tension in the room thickened as the receptionist exchanged a confused glance with her coworker. "I think you've got the wrong idea," she said, hesitantly. The realization hit him all at once, like a bucket of cold water. The employee's baffled expressions weren't hiding anything. They genuinely didn't seem to know what he was talking about. He took a step back, suddenly aware of the weight of his accusations. "Look," the second employee said, her voice softer now, "if you're upset about something, maybe you should talk to whoever you're looking for directly." His face flushed with embarrassment as he realized how unhinged he must have seemed. He mumbled a quick apology, turning toward the door. The receptionist gave him a wary look, but no one stopped him as he walked out, the sound of the soft music following him into the night. Back in his car, he sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He felt foolish, like he had let his emotions get the better of him. But despite the humiliation, his determination remained unshaken. Something was going on, and he was certain Emily was involved. If this wasn't the place, he would find out where and why. Though his confidence had been shaken, his resolve only grew stronger. The truth, no matter how painful, was now something he couldn't avoid. Just as he was about to give up for the night, the door to the back of the building opened. Emily stepped out, her face illuminated briefly by the flickering neon sign. Her expression was calm, but the moment her eyes landed on her husband standing by the entrance, everything changed. "You're thinking about the money too much," she said. Her breath hitched audibly and she froze, clutching her purse tightly. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice trembling. The husband's heart sank at the sight of her. There was no plausible excuse for why she would be here. No explanation that would erase the betrayal he felt crushing down on him. "I could ask you the same thing," he said, his voice cold and distant. "But I think I already know." Emily glanced around nervously, as though searching for an escape. "It's not what you think," she started, but he cut her off, stepping closer. "Don't," he said sharply, his voice breaking. "Don't insult me by lying again. I saw the texts, Emily. I saw everything. And now this?" He gestured to the building behind her, his eyes filling with tears he refused to let fall. "How could you?" Her silence was deafening. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. The only sound was the faint buzz of the neon sign, a backdrop to the shattering of their once perfect life. The argument began the moment they got into the car. Emily sat stiffly in the passenger seat, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The husband, gripping the steering wheel, could barely contain the storm of emotions building within him. "Start talking," he demanded, his voice cracking with anger and pain. "What's going on, Emily? Why would you do this to us? To me?" And she hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper when she finally replied. "It's not what you think. I needed the money." The excuse felt hollow, like a drop in the ocean of his hurt. "The money?" he repeated, incredulous. "We're not struggling, Emily. If you needed something, why wouldn't you just tell me?" Tears welled up in her eyes, and she looked away, staring out the window as if the night held the answers she couldn't give. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "I've been feeling invisible. Like I'm not enough anymore. Like I'm just—" "Don't you dare make this about me," he interrupted, his voice rising. "I have been nothing but supportive. I have loved you, trusted you, and this is what you do?" "I didn't mean for it to happen," she sobbed, her defenses crumbling. "I was just trying to find something. I don't even know anymore." Her confession only deepened the wound. The husband pulled the car over to the side of the road, unable to drive any farther in his state. They sat in silence, the air between them heavy with shattered trust and unbearable sorrow. For the first time, it felt like the life they had built together was irreparably broken. The solemn silence between them, the tension in the car felt suffocating as Emily finally broke the silence. Her voice was raw, shaky, a mixture of guilt and defiance. "You don't understand how hard it's been," she began, wiping away tears that streaked her flushed cheeks. "It's not just about the money. It's everything." The husband stared at her, his jaw tight, waiting for her to continue. "You think everything is fine just because the bills are paid and the lights are on?" she said, her words gaining momentum. "But do you know what it feels like to be invisible? To wake up every day and feel like you're nothing more than the mom, the housekeeper, the afterthought?" Her voice cracked as she went on. "I never planned for this to happen. I didn't wake up one day and decide to ruin everything. But I was drowning, and no one, not even you, noticed." He shook his head, his disbelief evident. "So what? You thought this, him, was the solution?" "I wasn't looking for him," she shot back, her tone defensive now. "It just happened. He made me feel seen, like I mattered." The words stung, and her attempt to justify her actions only deepened the wound. Her gaze searched his face for understanding, but all she found was a hardened mask of hurt and anger. Oakham reached for her hand and held it away from her, but all she felt was a hardened mask of hurt and anger. His hands gripped the steering wheel, as if it was the only thing keeping him grounded. "You think I don't see you?" he said, his voice low but trembling with restrained fury. "You think I don't care? Emily, I've been here every step of the way, supporting you, loving you, and now you're telling me that wasn't enough?" She opened her mouth to respond, but he cut her off, his voice rising. "Do you even hear yourself? You're blaming me? Our life? For this? For him? That's what you're doing right now? I'm not blaming you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm just trying to explain. Explain what? That you lied to me? That you betrayed me? That you destroyed everything we've built together? His voice cracked on the last word, and he turned away, staring out the windshield as though it could offer him clarity. I made a mistake, she said, her voice trembling with desperation. I know that, but what? He snapped, his eyes flashing as he turned back to her. Do you think saying I made a mistake makes it better? Do you think it erases the fact that you put him, some stranger, above your family? Her tears fell silently now, but he felt no satisfaction in her pain. The hurt was too deep, the betrayal too fresh. I can't do this right now, he muttered, starting the car again. The drive home was silent, their broken words hanging in the air like shards of glass. The days following the confrontation were heavy with silence and resentment. The husband found himself avoiding Emily as much as possible, retreating into his own thoughts. But the anger, the hurt, and the lingering questions wouldn't leave him alone. The texts from Mike, the image of her walking out of that place. They played on a loop in his mind, fueling a cocktail of betrayal and inadequacy. One night, unable to bear the weight of it any longer, he found himself driving aimlessly through the city. The neon lights of the relaxation spa flickered in his peripheral vision as he passed by. He slowed the car, his gaze lingering on the unassuming building, its dimly lit parking lot casting long shadows. Without fully understanding why, he pulled in and parked. Stepping inside, the familiar scent of lavender and something faintly medicinal hit him. The receptionist greeted him with a polite, practiced smile, but he barely registered it. His thoughts were a chaotic mess, part rage, part curiosity, and part something he couldn't quite name. Before he could talk himself out of it, he found himself in one of the rooms, its dim lighting casting everything in a soft, almost surreal glow. The moments that followed blurred together, muted conversation, the touch of unfamiliar hands, and the fleeting, hollow satisfaction it brought. But as quickly as it began, the weight of his actions crashed down on him. Lying there afterward, he stared at the ceiling, his chest tight with regret. He hadn't come here for pleasure. He had come out of desperation, a misguided attempt to reclaim some sense of control. Instead, he felt only shame, like he had betrayed himself and the very principles he thought set him apart. On the drive home, the guilt grew heavier with each mile. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had stooped to the same level of betrayal he had condemned Emily for. The hypocrisy gnawed at him, leaving an ache in his chest that no apology could soothe. As he parked in the driveway and turned off the engine, he sat in silence for a moment, staring at the darkened house. The glow from the porch light seemed cold and distant, like the life waiting for him inside. He had crossed a line, one that could never be undone, and now he had to face the consequences, not only of Emily's choices, but of his own. A few days after his moment of weakness, the husband reached out to Tom. They met at the same bar as before, the dim lighting and muted conversation offering a semblance of privacy. The husband's guilt and confusion weighed heavily on him, and he hoped Tom could offer clarity, or at least a listening ear. As they settled into their seats, the husband didn't waste time. I need answers, he said bluntly, his voice edged with desperation. Emily's involved with someone named Mike. Do you know anything about him? Tom hesitated, his fingers tapping anxiously on the edge of his glass. His reluctance was palpable, but after a long silence, he leaned in and spoke quietly. Mike's not just some random guy, he began, his tone grave. He's dangerous. He runs a network, coercing women into working for him. It starts off innocent enough, offering financial help, a shoulder to lean on. But then he manipulates them, isolates them, and makes them feel like they have no choice. The husband's eyes widened as Tom continued. He's good at what he does, figuring out their vulnerabilities, exploiting their fears. Most of the women he targets don't even realize what's happening until they're too deep to get out. The weight of Tom's words settled like a stone in the husband's chest. "And Emily?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Is she complicit?" Tom sighed, his expression somber. "It's hard to say. She might not have been entirely willing, but she's involved now, whether she likes it or not. Mike doesn't let go easily." The drive home from the bar was silent, save for the hum of the engine. Tom's revelation had shattered the narrative the husband had been clinging to. The betrayal was still there, but now it was tangled in something far more complex. Emily wasn't just a cheating spouse. She was a victim, a pawn in a larger, darker game. As he parked in the driveway, he sat for a moment, staring blankly at the steering wheel. His mind replayed the details Tom had shared. Mike's manipulation, the way he preyed on vulnerabilities. It made sense now, in a twisted way. Emily's secrecy, her sudden changes, even her defensiveness during their arguments. They all pointed to someone who was trapped. But the clarity didn't bring relief. Instead, it left him grappling with conflicting emotions. On one hand, he felt pity for Emily, a part of him wanting to protect her from this man who had ensnared her. On the other, the hurt and anger over her actions remained. She had still lied to him, still betrayed their trust. And those wounds couldn't be easily dismissed. The complexity of the situation weighed heavily on him. He realized that this wasn't just about their marriage anymore. It was about pulling Emily out of whatever grip Mike had on her. But how could he help her when he barely understood the extent of her involvement? As he stepped inside, the house felt colder, quieter than usual. He knew he couldn't let things remain as they were. This wasn't just about uncovering the truth anymore. It was about figuring out what came next. The next morning, the husband woke with a renewed sense of purpose. The emotional turmoil of the past few weeks had left him battered, but Tom's revelation had lit a fire within him. This wasn't just about Emily anymore. It was about dismantling the operation that had ensnared her. But to do so, he needed proof. He began with Emily's phone. While she was in the shower, he unlocked it, his hands trembling. The messages from Mike were still there, along with others that revealed more about her interactions with him. Carefully, he took screenshots, forwarding them to a secure email account he had set up. He felt a pang of guilt invading her privacy, but the stakes were too high to hesitate. Next, he turned his attention to the relaxation spa. That evening, under the cover of darkness, he parked a block away and watched the building. Over the course of several hours, he took photos of the people coming and going, noting license plate numbers and patterns of activity. He noticed certain cars returning repeatedly, the occupants lingering just long enough to suggest more than a casual visit. The following day, he sought out Tom for advice on his next steps. "You'll need more than just photos and messages," Tom warned. "If you want this to stick, you'll need someone on the inside to confirm what's happening." Reluctantly, the husband decided to confront Emily. He approached her one evening, showing her the evidence he had gathered. "I'm not here to argue," he said firmly. "I want to help you, but I need you to help me take this guy down." Emily hesitated, her eyes wide, with a mix of fear and shame. After a long pause, she nodded, agreeing to cooperate. Together, they planned their next move. With Emily's reluctant cooperation, the husband began to piece together a plan. His priority was clear: expose Mike's operation without endangering Emily or their daughters. It wasn't just about justice, it was about ensuring their family could move forward, free from the shadow of this man. First, they contacted a local detective Tom trusted, someone with a history of dealing with these kinds of cases. Emily shared what she knew, details about Mike's tactics, the women he targeted, and how he kept them compliant. Though hesitant at first, her willingness to provide information grew as she realized the extent of Mike's manipulation. Next, they set up a meeting with law enforcement, presenting the evidence the husband had gathered. The messages, photos, and Emily's testimony painted a clear picture of the coercion and illegal activities taking place. The detective assured them that a raid was being planned, but emphasized the need for discretion to ensure its success. While the authorities prepared, the husband and Emily focused on protecting their daughters. They kept their routine as normal as possible, shielding the girls from the tension brewing beneath the surface. Emily stayed away from the spa, cutting all contact with Mike, which the husband monitored closely. The waiting was excruciating, every moment stretching into an eternity as they anticipated the raid. Despite everything, the husband felt a flicker of hope. For the first time in weeks, there was a clear path forward, a chance to bring this nightmare to an end. The night before the raid, as he sat with Emily at the kitchen table, he looked her in the eye. "This doesn't fix everything," he said quietly, "but it's a start." She nodded, her expression solemn. "I know," she replied, "but I'm ready to face it, to face these realities." The plan was in motion, and all they could do now was wait. The raid on the relaxation spa made headlines the very next morning. News outlets swarmed the scene, cameras capturing the police hauling out files, computers, and several employees. The glowing neon sign that once flickered discreetly was now a backdrop for flashing lights and reporters delivering live updates. "Alleged human trafficking operation busted in suburbs," read one headline. "Shocking scandal uncovered in quiet neighborhood," declared another. The story dominated the news cycle, with pundits and commentators dissecting the details of the operation and speculating about the people involved. As more information came to light, Emily's name surfaced, albeit buried in the middle of most reports. Her connection to the spa was mentioned as part of the broader investigation, but it was enough for those in their close-knit community to recognize her. The reaction was immediate and brutal. Social media lit up with speculation, outrage, and judgment. Comments flooded local forums, many condemning her outright. "How could someone like her be involved in this?" one post read. Others were less kind, labeling her a disgrace and questioning her role as a mother. The husband watched the coverage with a mix of anger and helplessness. He had known the exposure would come, but seeing it unfold so publicly was a blow he hadn't fully prepared for. The truth was out, but the fallout was just beginning. In the days following the raid, the once friendly faces of their neighbors turned cold. Emily, who had been a regular at PTA meetings and neighborhood barbecues, now found herself avoided at every turn. When she walked down the street, people crossed to the other side or pretended not to see her. Whispers followed her wherever she went, their judgment sharp and inescapable. At the grocery store, she overheard a woman mutter, "That's her," while casting a disdainful glance. In the school parking lot, parents pulled their children closer, as though her presence was contagious. The isolation extended to her closest friends, many of whom stopped returning her calls or texts. One friend, who had been her confidant for years, sent a single curt message: "I think it's best if we keep our distance for a while." Emily stared at the words, her heart sinking further into the pit of loneliness that had consumed her. At home, the silence was almost worse. The husband, though still civil, kept his distance, clearly struggling with his own feelings of betrayal and anger. The girls, sensing the tension but not understanding its cause, grew quieter, their usual laughter replaced by cautious whispers. For Emily, the weight of societal judgment was suffocating. The home that had once been her refuge now felt like a prison. Yet, amidst the isolation, a small voice inside her whispered that this was only the beginning of her reckoning, and that she would have to find the strength to face it. The day the papers arrived, the house was eerily silent. The husband sat at the dining table, the stack of documents in front of him a tangible representation of everything that had gone wrong. Across from him, Emily sat with her hands folded in her lap, her face pale and drawn. Neither of them spoke for several long minutes, the tension between them almost unbearable. Finally, he picked up the pen, his hand trembling slightly. As he began to sign, memories flooded his mind. Their wedding day, the birth of their daughters, the laughter that once filled this very room. Each stroke of the pen felt like a small death, a piece of his life he would never get back. Emily watched him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I never wanted it to end like this," she said softly, her voice breaking. He paused, looking up at her. "Neither did I," he replied, his tone heavy with sorrow. "But we can't keep pretending there's anything left to save." When it was her turn, she hesitated, the pen hovering over the page. For a moment it seemed as though she might refuse, might fight for one last chance. But then she sighed and signed her name, her hand steady despite the tears streaming down her face. The process took less than an hour, but when it was over, the weight of finality settled over them both. The marriage they had built was officially over. Breaking the news to their daughters was the hardest part. The husband and Emily sat together on the couch, their expressions somber as the girls looked back at them, confused by the tension in the room. "Mom and Dad need to talk to you about something important," Emily began, her voice trembling. She glanced at the husband, who nodded, signaling her to continue. "We've decided that we're not going to live together anymore," she said, her words slow and deliberate. "But that doesn't change how much we love you, both of us." Lily, the younger of the two, burst into tears immediately, burying her face in Emily's lap. Sophie, older and more perceptive, narrowed her eyes at them. "Is this because of what's been happening? The stuff everyone's talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling with restrained anger. Neither parent knew how to respond. Finally, the husband said, "This is about us, Sophie. Sometimes things don't work out the way we hope." The days that followed were marked by a quiet heartbreak. The girls adjusted as best they could, but the cracks were visible. Lily clung to Emily constantly, while Sophie retreated into her room, avoiding them both. For the husband, the silence in the house was the hardest part. Sitting alone at the dining table, he stared at the empty chair across from him, the memories of their life together haunting him. The family was fractured, and though time might heal some of the wounds, he couldn't help but wonder if things would ever truly be whole again. The opportunity came sooner than expected. The police were ready to move on Mike, but they needed a distraction to ensure he wouldn't slip away. The husband volunteered, driven by a need to face the man who had torn his life apart. The meeting was set up at a local diner, a neutral location that felt too ordinary for the confrontation that was about to unfold. As the husband sat at a booth, his palms slick with sweat, the door opened, and Mike walked in. He was confident, almost casual, his polished demeanor masking the predator beneath. Mike slid into the seat across from him, his smile cold. "So, you're the husband," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "I've heard a lot about you." The husband leaned forward, his voice steady but laced with anger. "I know what you've done," he said, locking eyes with Mike. "Not just to Emily, but to all those women. It ends here." Mike chuckled, leaning back as if amused. "And what are you going to do about it? You think you can stop me? Men like me don't go down because of guys like you." But the husband didn't flinch. "I'm not here to stop you," he said, his voice lowering. "I'm here to watch you fall." At that moment, Mike's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing. Before he could react, the door burst open, and plainclothes officers entered, their badges flashing. John helped Gabby to her feet. Mike's confidence evaporated as law enforcement swarmed the diner. "Mike Thompson," one of the officers announced, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, trafficking, and coercion." Mike tried to rise, his bravado returning in a last-ditch effort. "You've got nothing on me," he shouted. But the officers weren't fazed. One cuffed him while another read him his rights. The husband watched in silence, his hands trembling under the table. A mix of satisfaction and lingering rage coursed through him as Mike was led away, his protests growing fainter with each step. As the diner returned to its usual rhythm, the husband stood, his legs shaky. An officer approached him, offering a nod of appreciation. "You did the right thing," the officer said. We couldn't have done this without you." He nodded, though the victory felt hollow. Mike was out of their lives, but the scars he had left would take far longer to heal. As the husband walked out into the evening air, he felt a sense of justice, tempered by the realization that this was only one step in a long journey toward rebuilding what had been broken. The raid unfolded in the early hours of a gray morning. A convoy of unmarked police cars pulled into the parking lot of the relaxation spa, their headlights cutting through the dawn's haze. Officers emerged, clad in tactical gear, their movements precise and coordinated. Inside, the spa's operations came to a screeching halt. Employees and clients alike froze as the front door was kicked open. "Police! Everyone stay where you are!" an officer shouted, his voice echoing through the narrow halls. The officers moved swiftly, securing the building room by room. Files, computers, and hidden ledgers were seized, their contents damning. The hidden back room, where much of the illicit activity occurred, was revealed to be a meticulously organized operation, leaving no doubt about the scope of Mike's network. Some employees tried to protest, claiming ignorance, but others broke down, providing the police with immediate information in exchange for leniency. The scene was chaotic, but the officers maintained control, ensuring that every piece of evidence was documented and every person detained. From a distance, the husband watched as it all unfolded, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was the culmination of weeks of pain, anger, and determination, a reckoning for the man who had wreaked havoc on so many lives. As the last officer exited the building, securing the doors behind him, the husband felt a flicker of closure. Justice had been served, but the journey was far from over. In the days following the raid, Emily sat in a stark interrogation room, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The decision to cooperate had not been easy, but she knew it was the only way forward, for her and for the family she had fractured. She spoke candidly with the investigators, detailing everything she knew about Mike's operation. Her testimony proved crucial in understanding the inner workings of the network, from how Mike recruited his victims to the methods he used to keep them compliant. Though her role in the operation was minimal, her knowledge filled in gaps that strengthened the case against him. The process was grueling, and every question felt like a reminder of her mistakes. But Emily pressed on, her resolve growing stronger with each session. She wasn't just seeking forgiveness from the authorities. She was trying to make amends for the harm she had caused. The husband, though still grappling with his own emotions, couldn't help but admire her courage. Watching her take accountability, even in the face of societal judgment and personal shame, was a step toward healing. When the investigators thanked her for her cooperation, Emily nodded solemnly. "I just want to do what's right," she said quietly. For the first time in weeks, her voice carried a sense of purpose. The road to redemption would be long, but Emily had taken the first step, and though the scars of their ordeal would remain, there was a faint glimmer of hope for a better future. The days following the raid and Emily's cooperation marked the beginning of a new chapter for the husband and his daughters. Though the scars of betrayal and turmoil lingered, he was determined to provide a stable and loving environment for the girls. He poured himself into the little moments, helping Lily with her science projects, attending Sophie's soccer games, and making Sunday breakfast a cherished ritual. The laughter that had been absent from their home began to return, slowly but surely. It wasn't the same as before, but it was a start. In his quiet moments, the husband began focusing on himself as well. He joined a local support group for those dealing with marital struggles and betrayal, finding solace in the stories of others who had walked similar paths. He also took up jogging, discovering that the rhythmic pounding of his feet against the pavement offered a surprising clarity of mind. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to dream of what the future might hold, not just for his daughters, but for himself. He started reading books he had always meant to get to, took a weekend woodworking class, and even reconnected with old friends he had lost touch with during the chaos of the past few months. Though life wasn't perfect, there was a growing sense of balance. Each day brought new challenges, but with them came small victories that reminded him that moving forward was possible. Late one evening, after the girls had gone to bed, the husband sat on the porch, sipping a cup of tea and staring out at the quiet street. The events of the past months played through his mind like a fragmented film, each scene filled with pain, anger, and moments of unexpected strength. He thought about Emily. Though their marriage was over, he had started to see her not just as the woman who had hurt him, but as someone who had been lost, trapped, and ultimately brave enough to confront her mistakes. Forgiveness was a complicated thing, but he was learning that it wasn't about excusing what had happened. It was about freeing himself from the weight of bitterness. The journey had changed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had discovered a resilience he didn't know he possessed, and a capacity for growth that gave him hope. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he felt stronger, more grounded in who he was and what he wanted. As the night deepened, he closed his eyes and let the cool breeze wash over him. "We're all flawed," he murmured to himself, "but it's how we rise after falling that defines us." For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. Life would never be the same, but perhaps that was the point. In the midst of chaos and pain, he had found something new, a chance to rebuild, not just for his daughters, but for himself. The living room was bathed in the soft glow of a late autumn sunset, the golden light casting long shadows across the walls. The husband sat on the couch, a book resting in his lap, but his attention wasn't on the pages. Instead, he watched his daughters, their laughter filling the room as they played a board game on the floor. Lily giggled as she rolled the dice, her cheeks flushed with excitement. Sophie, ever the strategist, leaned forward, calculating her next move. The sight of them, so carefree, so resilient, brought a small smile to his face. They had been through so much, yet here they were, finding joy in the simplest moments. He leaned back, closing his eyes briefly. The weight of the past months still lingered, but moments like this reminded him of what truly mattered. The girls were his anchor, their presence a constant reminder of the love and responsibility that defined his role as their father. As the game ended, Lily climbed onto the couch beside him, curling up against his side. "Dad, are we okay?" she asked softly, her wide eyes searching his face. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "Yeah, sweetheart," he said, his voice steady. "We're going to be okay." Sophie joined them, sitting on his other side. For a moment, they sat together in comfortable silence, the warmth of their shared bond stronger than any words could convey. Later that night, after the girls had gone to bed, the husband stepped outside onto the porch. The night was crisp and clear, the stars scattered across the sky like tiny beacons of hope. He took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs as he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. Life, he realized, was infinitely complex. It wasn't just a series of black and white choices or neatly resolved endings. It was messy, unpredictable, and filled with moments that tested the very core of who you were. But within that chaos lay the opportunity to grow, to learn, and to find meaning in the struggle. He thought about Emily, the mistakes they had both made, and the pain they had endured. Forgiveness still felt distant, but understanding was within reach. They were two flawed people trying their best, and while their paths had diverged, he hoped she would find her own version of peace. Looking up at the stars, he whispered, "We stumble, we fall, but we keep moving forward. That's what makes us human." As he turned to go back inside, he felt a sense of quiet resolve. His life was far from perfect, but it was his. And in the midst of everything, he had found a truth worth holding on to. The strength to rise after falling was where true healing began. The door clicked shut behind him, and the house embraced him with its warmth. For the first time in months, he felt ready to face whatever came next.